y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at RefTelis and GovLove co-host. We have a great episode for today. We're going to be talking recruiting and retention in transportation. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government, and your membership goes to directly support this podcast. So if you want to keep hearing episodes, go become a member today. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Laurel Paget-Seekins is the author of People First, a report by TransitCenter on elevating human resources to address the workforce shortage. She spent 6 years at MBTA, which I believe is Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, if my memory is correct. Yeah, and also at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. She led the data analytics team and was the assistant general manager for policy. She has a master's in city and regional planning and a PhD in civil engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Laurel was the 2021 Open Society Foundation Leadership in Government Fellow, and she's the co-editor of Restructuring Public Transport through Bus Rapid Transit and author of numerous articles at the website Transit Data Primer. So with that, Laurel, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Good. I'm glad you caught. I was glad I could test my my acronym lingo that you were able to to confirm that I remember.
Yeah, the Massachusetts Bay.
Yeah. Awesome. So we have a tradition on the podcast to ask a lightning round to get to know our guest a little better and allow you to warm up. So for my first question, what was the first concert that you went to?
So I grew up going to music festivals, folk and bluegrass musical festivals with my parents. So
Nice.
sort of hard to know what counts as the first one. But yeah, I went as a kid, went to a lot of music festivals.
Oh, wow. So is there one that sticks out as like very memorable or?
In terms of performance?
Yeah.
We
or
also
the festival,
organized and ran our own music festival in my hometown.
Oh my gosh.
And so as like a teenager, I was like running the concession stand for the artists to sell their merchandise. So I got to meet all these artists and help them sell their CDs.
That's awesome.
And they would always give me the CD as like a thank you. So my like first record or like CD collection was always through that.
That's awesome. Is there an artist you remember that was like, these people were great and now they're like big or something? Or
It was all pretty small because it was a pretty small festival. But definitely some good music.
Cool. That's very cool. All right. So what's the last movie, TV show that you watched?
Well, so right now I've been watching the Women's World Cup, which requires getting up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
I'm on the West Coast. And so I haven't gotten up for all the games, but a few. But I've been watching a YouTube show done by two former players called The Recap Show. It's on YouTube, who are just talking about the tournament, but also just about women's soccer and really trying to redefine how we talk about women's sports. So that's been fun.
That's awesome. Awesome. And is West Coast better than, because I feel like on the East Coast it was like 2 or 3 a.m.
It's between 1 and 3 a.m. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's all slightly better, I guess.
I don't know. All
right. What book are you currently reading?
So I'm one of those people who was always reading a bunch of books at the same time. The last book I finished was this great memoir by Dorothy Lazard called What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World. And it was interesting to me both because it's a memoir about growing up in Oakland and San Francisco, which is where I'm located. But as the title indicates, it's really about curiosity and being a person who's constantly learning, which is great trait to have.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, then my last lightning question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
I feel like I have my best thoughts when I'm riding my bicycle. And I think some of it is just like sort of that being in motion, but also, and this is something that's been hard since COVID hit, is that commute time. So being a bike commuter was a way that I was able to sort of process my day between work and home. And so that it was always a good sort of having that transition time and thinking through everything that happened, or on the way in, like what I needed to do, what my goals were for the day.
Yeah. Now, I've turned, because since I started working from home, I turned the dog walks into that time.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, I can relate to that. Awesome. So I always like to ask folks how they kind of ended up in this work. And so I know you used to work directly for a local government, and now you're kind of doing more research and consulting. So how'd you kind of end up in this field, and maybe talk about your career path a little bit?
Sure. I ended up in transportation because I moved to Atlanta, Georgia without a car in my pretty fresh out of college in my early 20s. And I realized that transportation was in the intersection of climate and environmental issues and racial and social justice. And I was like, oh, this is sort of a lever that we can pull to have impact in all of these different arenas. And so that's how I got into transportation. And at first I was an advocate and an academic. And then I worked both in the US and internationally. And then I was offered this role at the MBTA in Boston, and was like, oh, okay, this would be interesting to actually try to see what I can do to make change from the inside. And so I spent 6 years there.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, when you first moved to Atlanta, because what was that experience like, trying to navigate without a car? Because I think if folks haven't been or know anything about kind of the Atlanta metro, they'd probably not think it was very friendly to folks without a car. So what was that?
Yeah. And this was 2000 something, 2003 or something. And so even then, I think bicycling was there was hardly any bike infrastructure at the time. It's improved significantly. But I think it really opened my eyes to understanding sort of the impact of how racism played into transportation planning in this country, and sort of how that shaped the transit network that was there, and who was riding transit, and how they were being not prioritized. Their needs were not being prioritized in transportation planning. So it was a big kind of wake up call for me, riding transit in Atlanta.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you shifted gears and worked for MBTA. So what was that role? Because I think I read you were in the Office of Performance and Innovation. So what were some of the things you got to work on in that role? Can you talk about maybe coming into that organization and trying to set up something like that?
Yeah. So, well, yeah, it was tricky in the sense that I started right before an administration change, and also right before Boston had 100 inches of snow. And so there was sort of this, a lot of shift in the organization, and then a lot of priority put on the organization. And so while it was sort of this crisis moment, it provided a lot of opportunity for me and my team to step in and help. And so we were able I sort of joined forces with the MassDOT side. So we had a shared Office of Performance Management and Innovation for the MBTA and MassDOT. And so I was on the MBTA side, but we really had a combined shared service where we were able to put together all of the data from across transportation, which really was a great way to be able to understand transportation holistically. So we had, the highway data, we had the MBTA transit data. We also had the Registry of Motor Vehicles, or the DMV, it's often called in states. So we had all the sort of data on, car registration. So we were able to sort of think and answer problems across all of these different modes, pulling all of these data sets together. So that was a really great sort of place to be in an organization. And we also were kind of walled off from the daily crisis in this sort of mini think tank that was doing research and analysis and running customer surveys and pilot projects, and managing our open data and performance data that was we're releasing to the public. So it was really a great opportunity to really think multimodally, but really in a sort of interdisciplinary way about transportation.
Yeah, the interdisciplinary aspect is fascinating. So what did that add to be able to have some of that highway and driver data that maybe traditional transit agencies or departments wouldn't have access to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it allowed us to sort of think differently about some of the problems. And so one example that comes to mind is they were trying to figure out for a particular sort of stretch of state highway, sort of how congestion had changed, and they didn't have it didn't have the data sets that the highway division normally used. And so we were able to track bus speeds on that section over time because we had the bus data, right? To be able to create kind of a longitudinal sense of how congestion had changed. And that was just like, oh, well, we have this data of our bus speeds. Why can't we use it to solve this highway problem? So that kind of thinking was encouraged, as well as we had people with just really different academic backgrounds and experience, in lots of younger folks, but some folks who'd been in the department. My manager had been in the department for 10 years, and so was able to really also provide that institutional knowledge of why things work the way they do.
Yeah, very cool. So, and then you had one other career stop that I wanted to ask about before we got into the meat of our conversation today, but you served as a leadership and government fellow for the Open Society Foundation. So, and you did some work on transit equity. So I don't know, could you talk a little bit about that project? I don't know if there's anything you want to share about some of the work you got to do as a fellow.
Sure. And let me just give a plug real fast for the Leadership and Government Fellowship Program, which is, it's a fellowship program for people in sort of mid and senior roles coming out of all levels of government. So whether that's local government, tribal government, state, federal, and they pick 5 to 6 people a year and give this fellowship to, which is really a sabbatical essentially from government, where you're able to do a project and really think about what you've learned and how to share it. And also just meet other people who maybe have been struggling with the same issues you have, but in a totally different place in government, whether it's, so it's a really great network as well. Fascinating. Yeah. Super grateful for that experience.
Really cool.
Yeah. And so the project that I pitched, and worked on was, so I basically left the MBTA at the end of 2020, super burnt out from working through the first year of COVID. And but was thinking about sort of how equity changes are made through the relationships between community organizations and transit agency staff. So not at the sort of elected official level, but at the actual policy implementation level. And so sort of how we can understand sort of each other's realities better, both what communities' barriers were to using transit, but also how community organizations could better understand sort of the barriers to making change in complex organizations that staff felt met. And so I ended up sort of creating 3 different pieces of work from that, one of which is this website called Transit Data Primer that kind of explains the data sets the transit agency uses to think about service, with the goal of helping advocates and community organizations better engage with decision making. And then I also made a board game about complexity in government that came out of the Office of Performance Management Innovation team. We had sort of put it together during my time there, but I sort of formalized it as part of my leadership and government project.
That's cool. If folks want to learn more about the project, could we add a link to our to the notes for this, or is it out there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So we'll be sure to add kind of more info about that to the notes for this episode. Awesome. But the bulk, or the reason we want to have you on is talk about, you were the author for a recent report from TransitCenter titled "People First: How a More Strategic Approach to Human Resources Can Help Transit Agencies Attract and Retain Talent." And I think part of why I think this is interesting is it's having a particular effect on transit agencies across the country. But this is a problem for, I would say, local government agencies and departments in any sector. So, I think as I went through the report, I think there's some lessons learned and some takeaways that could be applied to any kind of department. But in particular, the impacts on transit are pretty interesting. So can you maybe talk a little bit before we get into some of the things you found about the origins of the project and maybe the problem you wanted to explore?
Sure. TransitCenter, which is a foundation that works on, transit nationally in the US, reached out to me sort of with this idea of wanting to do some work on the workforce challenges that transit agencies were focused, but not necessarily. They had done some work on bus operators, and they were just wanting to think more generally and about folks who, worked maybe in the more behind the scene roles. And so I started by just interviewing a whole bunch of people who were current or former transit employees about, what it was like now, what their challenges were. And just HR problems and solutions emerged as a major theme, whether it was frustration with the time to hire, that waiting for someone to retire to be able to advance, supervisors who haven't been trained how to supervise, lack of, good ways to address interpersonal conflict in the workplace, just a whole bunch of themes that all sort of tied back to the broader people and culture HR realm. And I realized that I have been a consumer of HR services, right? I've applied for a lot of jobs. I'd been a hiring manager at the MBTA, and MassDOT had hired a bunch of people for a number of roles. But I hadn't thought a lot about why HR is often felt to be so frustrating. And if this is a recurring problem, there must be like structural problems. It's not just that, this particular person working in HR is, not helping me in the way that I want, that there must be like really structural problems that need to be addressed with how we do HR in public agencies.
Yeah, if it's a common issue kind of across, then there's something bigger going on than just an individual failing. Yeah, that's fascinating. So what were some of those things that, or actually first, like, so specific to transit agencies, what are some of the, and I think you've mentioned a couple already, but some of the recruiting or retention challenges that are maybe unique to transit, or and maybe they're not, but what were some of those things that you kind of came across that were HR challenges?
Well, just sort of zooming out big picture, I think that some of these challenges are similar for other aspects of local government, but one of which is just the 24/7 operations nature of the work, and that you don't have any time as an organization to ever stop, reflect, have a mental health day, anything, right? You have to be constantly always on. Creates just a climate or a culture in an organization where it's just crisis management, right? Yeah. And then that you were layering on top of that ethos that transit is a shared public space, and this makes transit, super and critical to our society, but it also means that all the problems of society spill over onto transit. So right now, transit agency employees are on the front line of addressing homelessness, addiction, antisocial behavior, post-pandemic. All of these things are impacting, the transit workforce. Also, layered on top of that, you have transit agencies like other, government infrastructure facing years of underinvestment. So especially in the older agencies like the MBTA where I was working, things break constantly. So you're also always constantly responding to that. Meanwhile, climate change is creating a whole new level of impacts that agencies both have to respond to and prepare for. So the exciting thing is transit is looked at as a solution, right, to many of these problems, but at the same time is impacted by the problems. So it makes roles in transit both very exciting and extremely stressful.
Yeah. It increases their importance while at the same time being more stressful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of the foundation on which I was sort of thinking about. And I think this about transit, I think it, applies probably to some other components of local government, but really about just how important and hard it is to work in transit agencies right now, which is why it's so critical that we figure out how to solve these problems. Yeah.
Well, so you wrote about some of the impacts of this staffing shortage. So can you talk about some of those? Like how is this impacting like the operations? So, because I think folks in local government are sometimes used to being, hey, we're understaffed, you're overworked. Like that's just kind of the norm to some extent. But this has gotten to a point in some of these agencies where it's affecting operations. So can you maybe give a couple of examples of what you found?
Yeah, I think that the lack of the workforce shortage is having impact on the public in a very direct way. Like you said, the lack of government capacity impacts the public in small ways every day, but it's hard to see. But when your bus doesn't show up or your
Yeah.
agency says, oh, we're cutting your service because there's no one here to drive it, you're like, oh, there's a problem. Like, it's very clear, direct line between not enough people and not being able to provide the service. So that has like elevated this problem, which already existed before the pandemic, which was predicted to be a problem 20 years ago. So it's not that we didn't know. I think it's just that we didn't have the sense of urgency that, you know, we can't actually put all the service out that we have promised to our communities anymore. That creates what I think is both, it's a huge challenge, but it's an opportunity, hopefully, to implement some of the structural changes that are needed to fix this problem, right? So we're not constantly facing it. Because there's some short-term solutions that agencies are putting in place, you know, like hiring bonuses, those types of things. But if we don't impact some of the more structural changes to make transit agencies really good places to work, we're just going to be constantly, you know, in crisis on this.
Yeah, no, and so can you talk about some of those structural things? Because I thought that was fascinating when you were like, there was a report, you know, literally written 20 years ago in 2003 that said XYZ, and
this is going to happen.
Yeah, agencies are dealing with XYZ. So can you talk about some of those structural things that were maybe known but are now like really hitting?
Yeah, so I think part of it is the demographics of the workforce are changing.
Yeah.
And this is
that silver tsunami we've been promised. Yeah.
Right. Yes, that is happening. And people aren't staying in, you know, with the same employer for as long as they used to. So if you look at the general sort of data on the public sector, people have always stayed in public sector jobs longer than private sector jobs on the whole. But even the public sector sort of years of tenure at an organization is going down. And so that just, you know, means you have to hire more people just because people don't stay as long. So that's one piece of it. I think, you know, the demographics of the country are changing. Transit has always been a very male-dominated workforce. And so there's just sort of cultural and structural changes that need to happen to transit agencies to be more welcoming and inclusive to a more diverse workforce. I have like a really kind of basic example, which is I was talking to some folks, frontline workers at an agency who said, basically, until we got more women in the operator positions, there was like very limited access to bathrooms. But as soon as they were able to say, like, we have to address this issue if we have more women working in these positions, just like that was really basic needs that everyone should have an access to the bathroom on their, you know, at their workplace, being delivered, and is a different impact on women than men. And so some like really basic fundamental things have to change, as well as, you know, the more cultural issues of how interpersonal conflict is dealt with, how much, you know, discrimination occurs, all of harassment, those types of things. But just a lot of changes have to be made in order to make transit agencies workplaces that work for everyone.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Well, I think I also saw you wrote about how the skill set needed within the organization have changed too. So what are some of those maybe newer skill sets that agencies are having to recruit for that they haven't in the past?
Yeah, I think this is also a piece of this is impacting government across the board, which is technology changing and needing to modernize sort of all your back-end systems, whether it's sort of digital instead of paper record keeping, or, you know, what type of train control system you're using, right? And so that is really critically important to making transit be more efficient and how it runs, but just requires a tremendous amount of work because so many systems are just like really patched together on the back end between like really old technology or really sort of specialized technology that was developed by this one person who knows the code, right? That kind of thing. So there's just a lot of technology changes that needs to happen behind the scenes, as well as if you think about what's happened over the past, you know, 10, 15 years. And the public facing part of transit is, you know, real-time information is totally changing how riders and customers think about transit. So that just adds a whole new set of skills and jobs and ways that agencies need to be staffing and competing on the labor market for those tech skills. The other really big thing is vehicle electrification. So bus and rail, vehicle electrification, which is a whole bunch of infrastructure, but it's also has to change not just, the skill sets of the people doing maintenance, the skill sets of the operators knowing how to use the vehicles, but also how, in the case of bus electrification, the scheduling. So how, and the work shifts, so can electric buses do the exact same thing as diesel buses? Not exactly. So you have to think about how long can the bus be out there? When does it need to charge? All of these other factors have to be factored into the jobs of, the person who's actually scheduling the vehicle.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of change all at once.
Yeah. And that is a lot of change. And to your point, that's impacting government agencies, I would say, no matter the sector, but the way it's affecting the way that customers interact with transit is probably the biggest. That's probably bigger than what some other local government sectors are kind of dealing with. Is that customer piece and what their expectations are changing in relation to the technology. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully across the board, people are sort of demanding more of their public agencies in terms of user design of, government systems. And that there's a huge amount of work to be done, even, in particular, talking about HR in HR systems. If you've ever, filled out a particularly frustrating online job application where you're I uploaded my resume. Why do I have to import all this data again? I think that people's expectations of, technology systems is changing, and the government needs to catch up there. And there's a lot of, work being done by civic tech organizations on that. But the real-time information has this great ability to increase ridership and to make transit much more convenient in a way that we really need as we try to shift more trips onto transit to address emissions.
Yeah. All right. So I kind of want to shift gears into the HR aspect of this that you cover in the report. But so I guess I'm curious, though, to take a little bit of a step back before we get there. You see all these problems. Obviously, hiring is an issue. And I think your findings on one of the takeaways is about empowering HR, making a strategic partner. So what kind of led to that conclusion or that kind of focus of hey, it's almost about, the structure of HR and the place of HR within the system. How did you kind of end up going in that direction?
So as I mentioned before, I talked to a bunch of people who didn't work in HR, but who were sort of consumers of HR and who were very frustrated. So then I was oh, HR, super critical. So then I started talking to HR folks and sort of getting their perspective on it and realizing that they haven't necessarily been either resourced or empowered to solve the problems that the other folks that I was talking to were raising. And I think it's worth noting that, traditionally there's HR has been held by women. So there's a gendered sort of work role compared to much of the leadership of, transit agencies and the more operations and maintenance engineering side. And so I do also think that there's potentially this component of sort of this, people work, right, not being respected at the same level as the buses and the trains. And so there's sort of maybe some underlying problems there why HR has maybe not been fully empowered and resourced at the level that they needed to be. Yeah. I think also it has to do with there's just been this expectation that, government jobs are good jobs, people will always come. And that we didn't need to do anything differently. And so what that has turned into is that HR departments are really transactional. They are just trying to keep up with the paperwork, right? Be able to, hire to backfill and not usually have the resources to be thinking about planning ahead, what projecting out hiring needs, what where are we going to need more workers in the next 5 years, looking at our, retirement retention data across different skill sets and job classifications. Do we have the talent pipelines for those, either internally or externally? What additional training do we need? What roles or like relationships with community colleges do we need to be building? Much more of this forward sort of strategic partnership or work needs to happen. And in order to do that, you have to know, what is the agency planning and how does that translate into hiring and training? Whether it's planning a new rail line, whether it's planning a transition to electric vehicles, whether it's planning, any of these other sort of technical modernization projects, and be resourced with people who have the skills and the time to be able to be like, oh, you're talking about doing that. Have we talked about what that's going to require for hiring and training yet?
Yeah, I mean, that you kind of nailed the like strategic thought partner part and what HR could be doing if you empower them. Like that's a great summary. Like, and so often I think HR departments, both in transit agencies and in local government generally, they're downstream of those strategic, decisions, and like they're kind of dealing with the after effects down the line rather than being at the table. To your point, yeah.
And some of the workforce development is not short, right? And so there's another bigger structural problem, right, in our society that's not just impacting transit, is sort of the lack of people with the technical skill sets in some of these really niche roles, and that requires really thinking about training programs, partnerships with educational institutions and unions, thinking about how we talk about education in this country and what's valued. There's like some really big picture stuff, but it also is just we're gonna need a whole bunch of people with these really particular skill sets are retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. Is there even the labor market out there to replace them?
Yeah. So what are some of the kind of changes that you identified that will help empower human resources in order to be that strategic thought partner? What are some of the things that you think agencies should be doing?
So, I mean, part of it really is about the resources and skill sets of HR, and having people who are, as I said before, walled off from the daily crisis, right? That the amount of, daily operational transactional needs is always going to take all the time.
Yeah. And
so you have to create that sort of like, these folks aren't doing that. They're working on these more longer facing questions. And that requires having enough capacity to, to handle the daily work, as well as some sort of discipline of really trying to create that space for people in the organization. And I mean, the best example I had of this actually was talking to Alex Lawrence, who's the chief people officer for the city of Boston. So not a transit agency, but city of Boston worked closely with when I was at the MBTA, and sort of how she's thinking about this for the city workforce, and sort of that she made some sort of strategic hires to really sort of create that capacity in her team, and what skill sets she was looking for in those roles.
Yeah. Alex is a former GovLove guest, so that's cool. So then, kind of in addition to empowering HR, you also have some kind of more tactical, like here are some changes around practices and ways to improve retention. So what were some of those recommended changes you had around, and you don't have to get into every single one of them, but maybe the ones that you think are most important around hiring practices?
Let's start with hiring.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, obviously speeding up the timeline.
Yeah.
Critical. And, there's like many ways that agencies are working on doing that, whether it's just their practices on, how often they look at applications for jobs that are, they're constantly hiring, right? They're constantly hiring operators. Like, look at those applications every week. some of it is, just increasing the capacity of their HR department, bringing on more recruiters, building relationships with, community to be able to be doing, lots more events out in the community. And then there were some places who were using, technology to try to speed up the hiring process, with, allowing people to do their, assessments online instead of having to come in, or do asynchronous interviews. So there's, various approaches that agencies are taking, with really geared towards shortening the timelines for applicants and sort of streamlining their back end processes. Which, when I was talking to HR folks, they're like, that was step one, and a lot of them have sort of started working on that and have seen some success. And then they start looking at the data and realize, oh wow, okay, this doesn't work unless we can address retention, right?
Yeah.
Because I think one of them said, like HR is like pouring water in the top, and if there's a hole at the bottom of the bucket, then it's not ever going to fill.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're never going to catch up if people are still walking out the door. Yeah,
right. And
exactly.
And that retention has to be everyone's responsibility, right? It has to be an agency-wide mandate. Like, retention is a responsibility of everyone, every supervisor, everyone in the organization, and the HR has some roles to play in that. But everyone can't be looking at HR to solve that problem.
So, to that point, what were some of the, I don't know if they're best practices or findings you had to help improve retention, that were actions that maybe supervisors and, everyone could take versus like what maybe HR could do to support that?
I think the key, was all about training, right? Whether it was training for supervisors to be better supervisors, as I think we all know, and some data, supports that one of the key factors for whether someone stays in a job is their relationship with their supervisor. So how do we make sure that we're training supervisors to be supporting their workforce, especially when transit agencies are particularly very hierarchical organizations, and there's a lot of internal hiring. So it's often someone you were previously a peer with who's now your supervisor. Like, how do you make that relationship shift work? So training people to be supervisors is critical, and really laying out and making clear to everyone, how they can advance and the training that's needed for that. In general, there's sort of this rule of thumb that agency or organizations should spend like 2 to 4% of their labor budget on training. And in general, transit agencies sort of aren't meeting that, although it's very hard to kind of figure out, based on budgeting practices, exactly how much agencies are spending on training. But it's definitely not enough. And so that was a key recommendation, is making sure that the investment in training is really happening.
Yeah. And I mean, supervisor training obviously that's something I think
everyone needs.
Everyone needs. Is there other types of training in particular that like stood out as like, there's also this theme that we need folks trained in this area too?
I mean, I think that it's about making sure that people know what skill sets they need to be able to get in order to, advance through a career ladder. And so making sure that though those training opportunities are made available to be able to advance in the organization. And a key part of that is not just having the training, but also having enough employees that people can take your shift while you go to training, right? So it's sort of really thinking about how are we budgeting for our positions such that we have enough people in all the roles that there's that time for training to happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point. You have to have the capacity to let people leave for training, and when you're understaffed, it's a death spiral in some ways, because folks don't get the training they want and then they leave.
And I'll just say one other thing that was, there was sort of particularly stood out, is that my experience is in a major city transit agency that had close to 6,000 people in it, but most of the transit agencies in this country are very small and often run by local governments, right? And so which means one thing is that their HR department is spread thin, trying to hire across the entire city needs, city, county, whatever the jurisdiction, but then also that the sort of retirement, there's like much, I think, higher average age. So overall, the average age of transit employees is quite high.
Yeah.
But I think it's particularly higher in some of these smaller agencies where people have, been in these roles, and there's, only there's only a few roles, and there's not a lot of turnover for a long time. And as those folks retire, there's just potentially going to be a lot of knowledge walking out the door, and a lot of not necessarily people in place to step into the next role, right? Whereas some of these bigger agencies is sort of a constant hiring promotion practice. Yeah. So that is a place where sort of really figuring out how to implement succession planning is going to be critical for these smaller agencies. Obviously, it's important in big agencies too, but just when you have someone who's done the same role for 20 years, they might not have written everything down.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you make sure that that is all documented and that there's able to be people sort of coming up and training up before they retire? And so I talked to at least one person in a small agency who was like particularly concerned about that aspect.
Yeah, no, and that's like, again, I keep bringing this back to like, we hear that, I think, or I've heard that for all sorts of departments or functions of the local government, and it's a huge challenge because you don't want to lose that knowledge walking out the door. But it takes a lot of capacity within an organization to be able to do succession planning too, right? Yeah. And if folks are stretched thin and you're understaffed already, like adding that to their plate isn't going to get it done.
This small agency was telling me that their managers are, because they're short on bus operators, their managers are out driving the bus routes.
Oh wow!
Because you have to get the service out. Like people are dependent on it. Like their lives are dependent on the bus showing up so they can get to work or their appointments. And so, that always gets pushed to the back. It always gets pushed to the back.
Yeah.
Of wanting to do the strategic planning, wanting to do the succession planning and the training and all of those things that are critical. Beginning of the day, you have to get the service out.
Yeah. So, I think lots of folks will recognize the need for succession planning. Did you see any guidance, or did you find any agencies that are doing it well where, hey, these are the components of if you have the capacity and you're able to do it, this is what a succession planning could look like for transit agency.
There's lots of great resources that have come out of the various, there's Transportation Research Board and the various federal agencies have been, doing research and providing, best practice reports for years on this. I think it really is coming down to that question of capacity and sort of making it a priority in the daily. Like, how do we actually this is talking about the structural change, right? How do we actually implement it and integrate it into the daily operations of an agency? And some of that can be some policy changes about when you can hire a backfill for someone if they're still there so they can do the training before they leave. Like there's some maybe depending on where you are, right, there's some like little policy tweaks that might help, but a lot of it is just about capacity.
Yeah Well, I want to go back to something you kind of mentioned earlier, talking about creating career pathways. So first, why is that important, and why does that help with retention? Just I want to underline that. And then can you give maybe an example of like what creating a career pathway, like what that would even looks like in a, like how would you even go about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's allowing people who want to move up in their organization. So that's sort of the main idea, right? And that helps with retention because it gives you the ability to keep growing and increasing your salary and your responsibility. And it does exist, right? Like a lot of transit agencies are do a lot of internal hiring. That the supervisors come from the ranks of operators. But I think the key part about it is making it transparent, so it's open to everyone, and is and then showing people what the, like, sort of really visualizing it of like, okay, this is sort of sort of where we have our, what the MBTA calls their feeder pool. So like people who are coming in entry level into, different roles in the organization, whether it's an operator or a fueler or a track maintainer. And then from there, what are the sort of natural progression of within that, what would be the next roles? What are the, and like, it doesn't have to be linear, right? Like you could go over to be a dispatcher and then become, a chief inspector or something. Like there are different pathways through the agency in terms of the job classifications, but really giving people, some career coaching effectively of like, okay, like, where do you see yourself? What are you interested in? Like, these are the skills the training you would need to do in order to get from here to there. And making sure that it's open across the agency. So if you have people who are starting as a bus operator and they want to be working in your real estate office someday, right? That there's a pathway that they could go from there to there, even if it's not, just straight up and up the operations chain. Because people start as bus operators, but have all sorts of skill sets that can be used in the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I saw that in the report, it really jumped out to me because in my day job, we'll do like employee surveys, and there's often of organizations, and there's often it's almost like a catch-22 or I don't even know what the right word is, where you'll get this result where a lot of employees want to stay with the organization for their career. They want to be there a long time. At the same time, they don't see any advancement opportunities for themselves. And this is like a way to do that, is to say, hey, maybe that you can go from being a budget analyst to a senior budget analyst, but here's the way you can go up, and maybe it's a sideways jaunt, and then it's up to a different level, kind of in a different department or kind of across the organization, like spelling that out and making that clear that like, hey, here are all the different paths that are out there, and the training you might need or the skill sets you might have to acquire in order to take those steps. Because this seems like something that an HR or an organization could really spell out to like have a big impact on retention, I would think.
Yeah. So I think, it's about sort of documenting it for both on the organizational side, just to be able to understand like, oh, okay, if we project we're going to be, short on this role up here, how many people do we need coming in the bottom to be able to sort of fill it all? And then really documenting it for our employees to understand, what they need to do to get from here to there. And I think, it comes into sort of this, again, going back to, there is the good intention of doing that, right? And then it's just, is it prioritized? Is the information needed written down, or is it just always been somebody told you, right? Like how can we kind of formalize what's sort of already happening to make sure that it is available to everyone?
Yeah. Well, and to the formalize what's already happening, take a hard look at like, what are the job descriptions or the qualifications that we say we want, but there are folks probably within the organization in a different lower level job that might be qualified, but they don't see themselves in that job description for whatever reason.
That's obviously a huge piece that we didn't talk about in the hiring is revising job descriptions, both to allow more different pathways into them, and to make it more clear to people what the job actually is, so they could potentially see themselves doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another common theme. Like, actually, the job description actually is reflecting the duties that folks do, not just what they did maybe at one point.
Yeah. And I think that's also tied into the changing technology piece as well. Like, I remember my boss at MassDOT joking that she had job descriptions that were written before some of our employees were born.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's really funny. So then you had a section on workplace culture, and so I'm just going to give you free rein to kind of go where why you think this is important, why and ways that agencies can address this. But this is another one where I think HR has a huge role to play in like shifting culture and shaping culture and helping drive culture. But obviously, it's something that the whole organization has a hand in. So anyway, I'll just talk about kind of what you found and what are some of the things that you think agencies should be doing.
Yeah, and I think this the culture work obviously doesn't have to sit within an HR department, but it I think it needs to be working really closely with HR in terms of sort of what the sort of training and different programming and as well as the big thing that I talk about is how conflict is dealt with. And that goes into sort of thinking about, what training you're giving your supervisors, but also what processes are in place besides your sort of really formal equal opportunity employment type complaint process to address conflict in your workplace. Because there's a lot of conflicts that don't fit into that. And or maybe they fit into that, but that process is very long and drawn out and doesn't maybe provide the more immediate need that to address a conflict in the workplace. And so the work can have, but I guess part of what I'm thinking is that like there has to be, it's like a different set of skill sets than maybe you particularly find already in an HR department. So there has to be a group of people, whether they sit in HR or not, who are sort of thinking about culture and culture change work in a way that is not centering liability. Which I think a lot of HR work really centers liability, and there's good reasons for that. You want to make sure that you're running all your processes equitably and following all of the all the laws around hiring and benefits. But that centering of liability doesn't always necessarily build the right and best culture. So like balance between how do we make sure that we have the people who are focused on the liability piece, but also people who are thinking about culture from a different frame, whether it's a sort of more of an accountability framework of what does it look like for us as an organization to be accountable to our employees, or for people to be accountable for the work that they're supposed to be doing, or their behavior. So all of those things, I think, require a team of people who are focused on this, who have a particular set of skills, wherever they sit in the organization, but it needs to be closely aligned to what the HR department is doing to make sure they're not working at cross purposes.
Yeah. Well, and I hear you. I do think HR, like a way to make them strategic is to make them keepers of that workplace culture and like hold them accountable for that and give them resources to shape it. You're right. It doesn't have to sit there, but it makes a lot of sense. They've got to be aligned, and the culture piece. So I'm curious on I don't know if you heard anything about this in your interviews or as part of the process, or if maybe you did, and I don't remember it from the report, but there's obviously employee conflict, and that happens in any organization. But I imagine for transit agencies, there's also conflict with riders and customers, and supporting staff around that has got to be really difficult too. So I don't know if you heard anything about that. That'd be
So I do have an example in the report of what one agency is doing is a sort of peer response team, crisis response team. So you're right. Like there's been a huge jump in operator assaults across transit agencies in the U.S. Coming out of the pandemic. It's definitely impacting morale, recruitment, and retention for frontline employees, and also not just assaults, but just being on the front line, as I was saying before, of like helping people who are in crisis that are caused by policy decisions that are outside the scope of a transit agency.
Exactly.
And so that is creating some of the burnout and real stress that exists for transit workforces, and there's emotional labor that goes into addressing that. And if you don't have a formal way of doing it, it happens informally, right? There are people who often, again, tend to be women and people of color who end up playing these roles in organizations to absorb, that impact of crisis, whether it comes from, within the organization or with passengers on their peers. And so in order to to address sort of the equity problem with that, but also to make it so that everyone sort of has access to that peer support, there's this idea of creating this sort of peer response teams. So Portland, Oregon actually created this before the pandemic. I believe it was in 2019. And they did a formal training for, people who volunteered, who did an application to volunteer for this team, to really be trained in how to do crisis response for their peers. And so it's kind of it's like a hotline type of model, like you call and leave a message and someone calls you back. And they called it sort of mental health first aid, right? Just being that first line of support, figuring out if they need a referral to, a different service, or they just need someone to process, what happened, who maybe has been in the same situation before.
Yeah.
So that was a really great example of something that an agency is doing that is both formalizing this work that's already happening and also training people to be able to be more skilled in figuring out what to do in these situations and how to support each other.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's a cool model that you're probably replicable in other places, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Too.
I mean, it's so the training is not transit specific. They did, their training was the Critical Incident Stress Foundation, International Critical Incident Stress Foundation provided the training, and it's called Critical Incident Stress Management. And there's teams, existing already in local governments and other places that have been trained by this organization to do this work. And then they were just creating their own particular team for their agency.
Very cool.
So that, awesome. So other local governments and other agencies can use the same training or different training to create these teams.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, so we feel like we covered a lot of ground in the report. We'll be sure to link to it in the show notes and for this episode, so folks can kind of check it out and get more, because there's tons more information in there. And again, I think it's applicable to not just transit agencies, but other parts of local government. So, but is there anything else you want to highlight from the report or from your research, or things you found that you want to highlight?
I mean, I think just to end on a positive note.
Yeah.
I mean, I talked to so many people who are still so passionate about working in transit, believe in the mission, believe in are sort of so driven by the impact and be able to see that impact out in the world. And, obviously transit is so critical to addressing, critical climate change and social and racial equity issues that we're facing. We really need to figure out how to make the job sustainable for people. And that, whether that's about compensation or it's about, culture change and figuring out ways to kind of break the 24/7 crisis mentality. So there is the chance to do more of the, capacity building activities that we've been talking about, so that agencies can be more efficient and healthier places to work, and that ultimately everyone will benefit from that. But we really have to break a cycle of crisis response. And that I used to call it at the MBTA, the crisis treadmill, and it just got ramped up under COVID. We thought we were running at full speed, and then
turns out there was another gear.
Just got even worse. And so it's unsustainable. I think is what we're sort of reached a breaking point, and there's not enough slack in the systems to absorb the level of stress that both our people systems and our infrastructure systems are under right now, and we have to create more slack in the system.
Yeah, no, well said. Well, and I appreciate you shifted to the positive, because it is about supporting those folks that have that passion and that public service ethic that exists in transit agencies and exists in every aspect of the local government. And that's the most inspiring part about working for and with local governments is that kind of passion, I think. But
awesome. We can only ask so much.
Yeah, that exactly right. So we have a traditional last question on the podcast, and it's always the hardest one. If you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
Oh, Charlie on the MTA.
Charlie. Perfect. That's awesome. So our producer, Pizza Mike, will get that queued up. And with that ends our episode for today. Laurel, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate you sharing your research and talking through kind of what you found.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by Engaging Local Government Leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove, or on Twitter, or I guess X, whatever they're calling it now, at the handle @GovLove Podcast. And you can subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, go tell a friend, a colleague, your neighbor, the next person you see on the street about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. With that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
He never returned, no, he never returned, and his fate is still unlearned. He may ride forever streets of Boston, he's the man who never returned. Charlie handed in his dime at the Kendall Square station, and he changed for Jamaica Plain. When he got there, the conductor told him one more